So it's my pleasure today to introduce the session and sort of acknowledgement. We acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of the lands on which we stand, the Whadjuk people, and we honour their profound connections to the land, water, biodiversity and culture, and pay their respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. And so it's my pleasure today to introduce two great speakers that are part of our research group, my research group, and that really, my research group deals with aspects around understanding managed and native ecosystems and the services that they provide, ecosystem services of carbon, water, how that changes with climate change and disturbance. And so our first speaker, we'll have two speakers today. We'll take questions after the first speaker, and then at the half hour, we'll swap over and Atbin will take on the second slot. So, Caitlin basically got her PhD at Monash University, as I understand, under the best PhD supervisor in Australia, and she then went on to get a postdoc position at the University of Illinois, working with Carl's group in ecosystem and cropping, and she's going to talk to you today about what's the flux, so using flux towers to understand ecosystem, carbon and water cycles. Thanks, Caitlin. Take it away.
Thank you for that introduction, Jason, and thank you all for coming today. We've done our acknowledgement of country. It's just going to go away. And so, without further ado, the outline for today, I'm going to talk a little bit about my journey in measuring ecosystem fluxes. I started this journey in the tropical savannas of the Northern Territory for my PhD work, and then I moved, as Jason said, overseas to the United States, where I measured mainly fluxes from bioenergy cropping systems and other food cropping systems as well, at the University of Illinois. Hoping that'll disappear. And now I'm here and I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the work at the end, what I'm actually doing here at UWA in both native and managed ecosystems. And so first up, I even accounted for the little screen there, but then not the blocking of our titles. So first up, for those of you who aren't familiar with ecosystem flux measurements using flux towers and eddy covariance, essentially our flux towers measure radiation and energy fluxes as well as those of water and carbon. And so these diagrams are just to sort of give you an idea of some of the fluxes that we measure, as well as the terminology that I'll use throughout the presentation. And so we measure both shortwave and longwave radiation, as well as sensible and latent heat flux. So this is like our energy heat and our latent heat water vapor flux from ecosystems. And in particular, at the eddy covariance scale, we look at transpiration and evaporation combined as evapotranspiration from our flux towers. So we normally refer to that as ET. And then gross photosynthesis, which we call gross primary productivity. So it's basically ecosystem scale photosynthesis. And then the combination of autotrophic and heterotrophic respiration, which we normally refer to as ecosystem respiration. And lastly, our flux towers actually measure the net exchange of GPP and ecosystem respiration. And then we can calculate out and partition our net ecosystem exchange, our net ecosystem carbon flux, into GPP and respiration. And so how does this work? And so the basic principle of eddy covariance is that we have eddies, and these are parcels of air that are moving in a sort of cyclical rotational capacity outside on a day-to-day basis. And these parcels of air have a gas concentration with them, as well as a speed of direction and a movement and a direction of travel. And so you can imagine that over time, as these eddies are rotating around, they're carrying with them this information. And at the ecosystem flux scale, you can see here we've got our general wind direction, and then these little eddies can vary in shape and size, as well as as well as their wind direction over time. And so we've got our flux tower here in the centre of this particular landscape, and our little itty-bitty eddies all the way up to these big sort of mesoscale eddy rotation cycles. And so our instruments on our flux tower can basically then, we can calculate where a particle of air has come from, how quickly it's reached that point, and the CO2 and water vapour concentrations of those parcels of air. And so this does, an eddy covariance tower generally sees a fairly large area, and so it also depends on instrument height above the land surface. And you can see here that we call this a flux footprint, and so the area of the land surface that the flux tower sees. And here, essentially, if you've got low instruments lower to the ground, you see an area closer to where the tower is installed versus instruments higher up, which see a sort of a larger, more distant area of the field. And this normally, the contribution of eddies and to our flux tower measurements and what our instruments actually see is indicated here in this figure in the top right. Where our tower is actually located at distance 0, right below the tower, the instruments don't typically see the emissions from that particular area. So we can operate and fix instruments and troubleshoot and do some activities at the tower level, and it doesn't actually impact on the fluxes being measured by the instruments. But you can see as we move upwind, away from the flux tower, the contribution of eddies to our gas flux measurements is starting to increase, but it also hits a finite capacity. So the towers don't see for miles and miles and miles continuously, particularly during the day when you've got high atmospheric turbulence. So lots of mixing going on between the land surface and the atmosphere. And so from a bird's eye view of what this figure here is depicting, this plot here is a 200 by 200 metre field that I worked at the University of Illinois at. Our flux tower here is in the centre, and these sort of false colour image hotspots is where the bulk of our fluxes are occurring. So you can see that there's a space around the tower that's sort of empty of flux contribution, and then our field measurements and our fluxes are being contributed from this sort of the hotspot areas up to almost the boundary of the field. And so that's just to give you an idea about what these towers are actually seeing and what area of an ecosystem we're measuring. And so these towers operate at really high temporal resolution, so they collect 10 Hertz data, so that's 10 measurements per second. And so there's a lot of information, a lot of crunching of numbers and calculations that go on, because we essentially get this raw data, average it out into a 30-minute value usually, and then we do a bunch of post-processing, so quality assurance and quality checking of the data, because, for example, sometimes these sensors during a period of rainfall don't function all that well because they're open path, and so rainfall can hit the windows and cause errors in the data. And so we need to, as data users, actually visually inspect these data to make sure and use, sort of some trained QA/QC quality control procedures to omit data that are noisy and aren't representative of what is actually occurring in the ecosystems. But that also creates gaps in our data. And so in order to fill these gaps, we use external data sources, so from automatic weather stations located around the place, as well as some gridded ecosystem data from like the global grid data sets. And this figure here is basically just to show you how the process is applied in AusFlux, and different groups around the world have different routines, but they all basically follow this same principle where you get raw data in, and there's a number of steps of processing in order to get to the final product, which is here what we call our level 6 NetCDF file, which is the final data product that has our gap-filled time series of our flux data. It's all, which basically means that there's a measurement value for every single 30-minute time point in the file created. And we've taken our net carbon flux measurements that I mentioned earlier and partitioned them into gross primary productivity and respiration. And I could go into 3 hours of discussion with you about the principles behind all of that, but just know that there's a lot that goes into processing these data. And so we have a fairly rigorous, and generally it's increasing towards at least a national standard with AusFlux, but also a lot of these practices are extending into the global flux network. And so fairly rigorous data quality assurance with eddy covariance towers. And so moving into a brief description of my PhD work, and where basically my first experience really working with flux towers was in the tropical savannas of northern Australia. So I worked up here. We have a really long-term flux tower at Howard Springs, which has been running now for over 20 years. Jason actually set that up with his colleague Lindsay Hutley up in the Northern Territory. And so we have it measuring the tropical savanna ecosystems up here because they cover a very widespread area across Australia. And they're very much tree grass co-dominated ecosystems. So a lot of work has been done to look at how the fluxes from this ecosystem vary over time, interannually, seasonally, decadally, as well as the interaction of fire in these ecosystems. And my piece of the puzzle for my PhD work was to look at partitioning tree and grass productivity contributions. And so what I did to do this, I took the existing ecosystem flux tower that was already there and installed an additional tower in the understory so that I could separate the tree and the grass contributions. And so what we're seeing here over the 2 years of measurements that I collected in my PhD, the blue line indicates the gross primary productivity estimated from the whole ecosystem. And then the green is the understory flux tower measurements that includes mainly the grasses and some understory shrubs. And then the red here is the overstory, which is the difference between the two. And we can see that the understory contributes about a third of primary productivity to this ecosystem on an annual basis, where the overstory is accounting for about 2/3. But when we break this down into a wet season versus dry season situation, we can see that the grasses are really shooting up the understory contribution to almost half of gross primary productivity in the wet season. So they're really driving this kind of boom-bust seasonal cycle, particularly in the ecosystem flux tower. You can see it sort of shows this boom-bust seasonal productivity, but the overstory has a much more even, comparatively, contribution. And so using this combined paired flux tower approach allowed us to dive into this in more detail. 5 minutes. Okay, thank you. We have a lot more to go. I will talk quickly. Okay, and so this then, from this, we can then take the flux tower data, and we looked at this is showing results from a random forest analysis where we basically ranked the relative importance of different climate drivers that were really driving the productivity dynamics of the overstory and the understory. And so what we can see here is that we've got months of the year on the x-axis, and then our relative importance is up here on the y-axis. And the coloured lines basically show us that during the wet season, these systems, the productivity of these systems is limited by light availability, whereas when we hit the dry season, soil moisture becomes a much more dominant factor that's really driving the productivity of these systems. And then this bottom panel here shows that as the dry season progresses, the deeper soil moisture reserves are becoming more important as surface soil moisture is depleted. Okay, so moving on to my work at the University of Illinois in the US. So once I finished my PhD, I wanted to get some agricultural experience. I've always had a love of both ag and environment, which is why I really love this school, by the way. And so I moved to the US to get some agricultural experience, and basically to the heart of this really highly productive agricultural system of the US. So the Midwest, where all the corn and soybeans grown. And this is where the University of Illinois is located, in just south of Chicago. And my work, I was one of the first postdocs to join the Center for Advanced Bioenergy and Bioproducts Innovation at the University of Illinois. And this centre had three main themes. It was looking at feedstock development and genetic development of bioenergy feedstocks, how to convert the bioenergy into a usable product, and then some sustainability elements as well. And so I worked as part of the sustainability theme because we wanted to understand more about the biogeochemical cycling of these bioenergy crop candidates, because the US Department of Energy is investing quite a lot in bioenergy research. We have a poor understanding of where these crops can be grown, how much water is required to grow them, the nutrient requirements, how much soil organic carbon they're going to store below ground, all that sort of thing, as well as understanding where on earth we can actually build facilities to process the bioenergy product at the end, as well as the economic viability and resilience. How long is a bioenergy future likely to exist for in the US and globally? And so my role was to use eddy covariance flux towers to give us an ecosystem scale understanding of the bioenergy crop cycles. And so our main crops grown in the Midwest US is corn, usually with a soybean rotation. So they'll do a corn soy or a corn soy rotation. In 2018, we added some sorghum, bioenergy sorghum, to the mix, which is the biggest crop I've ever seen in my life. And we have these perennial bioenergy crop candidates, Miscanthus, switchgrass, and native mixed prairie grasses. And so basically our long-term flux analysis, these flux towers had been running for a period of time before I arrived, so about 8 to 10 years before I arrived. And my job was to collate all of these data and start to figure out some of the stories that the data were telling. And so the first thing that really came to mind when I looked at, this is looking at annual net ecosystem exchange, as well as annual evapotranspiration, our net carbon balance, this is subtracting the harvested yield from our net carbon fluxes, because that's carbon removed from the system. And then our annual water use efficiency, so carbon produced versus water used in the process. And so what we see is that Miscanthus, our perennial cropping system, is really the perennial winner when it comes to bioenergy crops, because it's taking up and storing the most carbon. So any value here that's below the zero line indicates a net carbon uptake in the ecosystem. Anything above the line indicates carbon loss. And so it's doing this mainly through its really extensive below ground root structures. And so even though it's harvested each year, it's putting a lot of carbon resources into its below ground root structures. And you're getting good bang for your carbon buck. So you're getting very little, less water used with the Miscanthus compared to the other bioenergy crop candidates. Excuse me. Next, we also had a look at what would happen to the carbon cycle and nitrogen, but I'm going to show you carbon today. The carbon cycle, if we revert our perennial switchgrass system, which was struggling after about the 8-year mark, back into an annual maize rotation. So what happens to the ecosystem fluxes, the below ground carbon storage capacity, and how long do we expect the below ground carbon benefits of a perennial system to stick around for after land reversion? And so this is my boss, Carl Bernanke. 𝒂𝒏𝒃𝒊𝒏 𝒂𝒂𝒃 and I led the carbon flux analysis, and then Evan Delucia's lab group helped with the below ground carbon cycle measurements, and Tara Hudiberg with her fabulous student Danielle Barati and Elena Blank-Beats helped with some modelling aspects. So we measured the fluxes for 2 years, and then they came in with a model to look at how do we project these data forward and learn from these flux measurements. And so what we found with the flux towers, that our maize converted systems, so switchgrass converted to maize, showed quite substantial differences in our net ecosystem exchange compared to the maize control that was operating alongside the converted field, and compared to our historic switchgrass fluxes. And this was primarily driven by increased below ground respiration, and a slightly, you kind of can't really tease apart the interannual uncertainty here as much, but it certainly suggested that ecosystem respiration was really driving this difference in fluxes. And our below ground soil measurements reinforced this. And so we saw differences in below ground soil respiration measured from Evan Delucia's group. And so where Tara and Danielle came in, we used the DayCent biogeochemical model to basically project forward the point at which our converted maize field would basically come back to look like a regular maize cropping system. And so the DayCent model suggested this would take about 5 years. So we measured with the flux tower for 2, and then the DayCent model suggested it would take 5 years for all the soil carbon benefits from that switchgrass perennial crop to be completely removed by the land reversion process. Okay, with this really nice long-term data set, we've been able to explore some of the variability in the maize cropping system as well, as we've seen quite a number of differences there. In the year 2012, we had a really significant drought. I mean, not for Australian standards, the drought wasn't significant, but certainly for the growing season, highly productive region of the Midwest US, it was a significant drought. And so what this here shows, this is our cumulative annual rainfall across the years of corn measurements. So the soybean years are omitted. And this yellow line in particular shows that we received very much below regular rainfall for the year 2012. The growing season, I think planting date is about at day 150, 160, and so you can see not a lot of rainfall occurring during the key crop establishment phase. It's also much hotter, so it's hotter and drier in this particular year. And this figure at the top here shows our gross primary productivity curves for regular seasons, and of course in the yellow here we see crop productivity dropping off much earlier in the growing season, which then translates into much less yield in this cropping system. And so from our flux measurements and our flux tower observations, we're able to start to see and match up yield loss with crop productivity metrics. Interestingly enough, so this is the time series of carbon fluxes from our maize system. So when the flux tower was installed right up here, and we've got gross primary productivity in blue, respiration in red, and our net carbon fluxes in the grey. And so our 2012 drought year is here, but then 2 years later, after a soybean rotation, so the little C's indicate a corn crop and the S indicates soybean, we see much greater respiration in the year 2014 and a little bit in 2015 as well. And so in particular here, for example, ecosystem respiration is outpacing primary productivity from the cropping system. And so, yep, this flux tower is indicating essentially the that combined with additional land management practices as well, we have lime as well as potassium, phosphorus and nitrogen applied at the start of the experiment. Now every year that corn's planted we have nitrogen added, but after the drought year we had the field limed again and additional potassium and phosphorus applied in 2014. So unfortunately we have no soil respiration measurements during those 2 years to verify if below ground respiration processes were enhanced, but the flux tower is certainly suggesting that there was likely potentially an agricultural priming effect going on and enhanced microbial respiration really driving these higher fluxes, because after the drought, these 2 years in particular were above average rainfall years. Okay, so we also then in 2018 added sorghum to the bioenergy mix. And so what we found, sorghum is an annual cropping system, much like maize, but its ecosystem fluxes had it behaving more like the perennial MS system. And so the idea is, the reason that 𝒂𝒏 is investigating sorghum so much is that because it produces such huge amounts of biomass. Here's me standing with a fully grown crop. It's about 4 to 5 meters tall and creates a ginormous amount of biomass. And so could it be used as an annual crop rotation bioenergy crop that produces a lot of biomass, but behaves more like a Miscanthus crop in terms of its carbon and water use. Okay, a little bit more to go, and I'm going to run over time, I apologise, but I'll try to be quick. Some more work that I was involved with was sort of more at the, I guess, cutting edge of flux tower developments at the moment, is the combination of sun-induced fluorescence measurements with eddy covariance monitoring at the ecosystem scale. And so chlorophyll fluorescence is one of the pathways in which excess light can be dissipated from the process of photosynthesis. We've got sunlight reaching the leaf surface, sun goes into photosynthesis, sun is dissipated through photochemical quenching, and a small portion of light is emitted as fluorescence. And satellite sensing technologies allow us to passively measure this chlorophyll fluorescence signal. This picture here of the globe is taken from the Albany Carbon Observatory, which measures sun-induced fluorescence, and you can really see that in July this hotspot area of the Midwest high productivity cropping system shows up. And so with my good friend 𝒂𝒏𝒂𝒂𝒍 and Kai Guan's lab, we set up a SIF observing spectrometer system alongside our flux tower in a soybean field. And what we found was a really strong correlation between SIF and gross primary productivity of the soybean field, particularly during sunny conditions, and the relationship decays a little bit under cloudy conditions, which has to do with canopy physiology, but also canopy architectural components as well. And so some of the work in the SIF space is teasing apart how much of this information is crop physiology, how much is canopy architecture, and what is actually going into this SIF primary productivity signal. And so the reason I mention this work is because this is what I'm doing here. We have in WA 4 flux towers that are measuring our native systems as well as our managed cropping systems out at the UWA farm, particularly across a rainfall gradient as well. And so we have one site at Gingin in the higher rainfall region, one out at Boygen, which is right near the UWA farm in the wheat belt area, and then our last one out at the Great Western Woodlands, the salmon gums out near north of Kalgoorlie. And so these ecosystems, the part of the beauty of using sun-induced fluorescence is that because it's a much more, I guess, ready measurement of crop productivity and photosynthesis, can we use it as an earlier crop or ecosystem stress detection spectral index from, say, satellite sensors that other indices tend to rely on greenness and changes in colour as an indication of ecosystem stress. And so we've got a bunch of these SIF. This is actually out in the taxonomic garden if anyone wants to go have a look at it. Testing, collecting some measurements at the moment, measuring a pretty sad looking potted fern, but the idea is that we're going to install these at all of our flux towers in order to measure SIF, sun-induced fluorescence, alongside our gross primary productivity. And so this is because this is a bit of a snapshot of what these 3 flux towers, I haven't got the UWA farm here, but our 3 native ecosystems along that rainfall gradient, how are they currently functioning? Well, you can see here our net ecosystem exchange, particularly at the Great Western Woodlands, is basically hovering around 0. So it's, at times it's a carbon source, at times it's a carbon sink, but is it an ecosystem that's already operating or living on the edge? And how quickly are our ecosystems likely to change as the climate changes, things get hotter, our ecosystems experience more stress? And so this is some of the work that I've been hired by Jason to do here in collaboration with folks at the CSIRO, Edith Cowan University, TURN, and the Department of Biodiversity, Conservation and Attractions. And so, very much out of time, so a big thank you to all the people who have helped me on this journey. There's a lot of you, and probably names that I've forgotten, and I apologise for that. And thank you to you all for listening, and any questions if you have time.
And don't go by that clock either.
No, right, I was going by that clock. Like, I have plenty of time. What are you talking about? I do not.
No, we've got time for a few questions, so perhaps if we start with one from the audience, and can we reduce that one and see if there are any questions in the chat as well? Okay. All right. Questions?
Threw a lot at you guys then, so.
So
Yes.
with the SIF, so you're planning on installing it on the top of the tower, and what is the footprint roughly of the SIF? And because the bottom of the tower is usually disturbed by people walking around on it. So if you want to get the native vegetation, are you pointing it downwards or looking at?
We're pointing it downwards, but it's got a cosine corrector, what we call on it, which basically gives you a fisheye field of view. So you're not measuring directly below the tower, you're measuring the signal from a broader footprint area of the canopy. It's not quite as large as what the flux tower sees, but the idea is that we install flux towers in a fairly homogeneous canopy area so that what's occurring over there is we infer is similar to what's occurring over here, because you would hope that the two systems are reasonably similar in terms of their larger scale fluxes. So there are footprint issues that are currently being investigated and assessed in the community at the moment, but yeah, the idea is to compare it at the ecosystem scale. But a good area for investigation. Maybe we find that in our WA systems it's not a big issue. Maybe it is. We need to then account and correct for that.
So get your talk ready whilst we're taking a couple of questions. Is it ready to go?
Yes.
And are there flux towers in other Mediterranean environments around the world? And is there similarities or differences between them? And how do they stand out on their own compared to flux towers in other areas, which you have, year-round rainfall?
Yeah, so there's the Flux has about 30 towers across Australia and New Zealand, and then we also feed into the around 950 to 1,000 flux towers around the world. And so, yeah, there's heaps throughout Europe and America. You look at the FluxNet map, and there's a big concentration in Northern America and in those parts. And so, yeah, I guess with these sort of more global scale analyses, you can start to pair up Mediterranean type climates and see, are they all operating similarly? Where are the differences and what's driving the differences? But that's not work that I lead. I like to do regional stuff.
An economics question. Sorry.
Cool. That's okay.
Are bioenergy crops actually economic without a subsidy? And are they still relevant?
So the Department of Energy in the US is really pushing it. 𝒂𝒊𝒏 is the 4th bioenergy research centre that they've invested in the US. It's a hotly debated topic, even amongst my colleagues that work on the techno-economic analysis of it and the long-term sustainability. But I think the overarching answer is that yes, if it's done well, if it's done properly. There are marginal lands or land areas that don't necessarily compete with food cropping systems that are either degraded or could be utilised for bioenergy production, and that's why I guess sorghum was a crop that they really focused on, because it can actually grow outside of the main sort of corn soybean growing range. And so, sort of not a great answer to your question, but I think there are camps that say yes and are pushing for it, and there are camps that say it's a waste of time. But I think by and large, my opinion is it's worth the investment if it can help us transition away from fossil fuel, from a fossil fuel economy. So, yeah.
Where are we? If it's a quick one.
Where's my chat? Was the maize produced with annual tillage, and if so, how much of the lower soil carbon in maize and annual system was due to ploughing lands versus the perennial miscanthus? Yes, so in our systems at the University of Illinois, we do conventional tilling on an annual basis, and so there's a lot of turnover of the soil carbon in those systems, whereas miscanthus is not touched at all. And so it has the time to build up below ground soil carbon biomass. And that's why I guess we looked at the reversion of switchgrass to maize to see, well, how quickly can that be turned over? There are no-till agricultural systems in the US, and we do have, my boss Carl has been working on a comparison paper of till versus no-till cropping systems. So stay tuned if you're interested. That paper I'm sure will come out shortly, but didn't have time to talk about it today. Hopefully that answers your question.
Great. Well, if you've got any further questions for Caitlin, she's got her email at the start of the talk, so get in touch with her. I'm sure she'd be pleased to answer any other questions offline.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Caitlin. So it's my pleasure now to introduce Atbin Mahabbati. He's a current PhD candidate in my group, and he's going to be talking about machine learning in agriculture, new algorithms and their potential applications. But he's now in the final stages of his PhD candidature. He's been doing some terrific work and getting a couple of publications out. And he's also been a great ambassador in the school, helping out with the postgraduate committee and so forth. So thank you, Atbin. When you're ready, you can take it away.
Yeah, thank you, Jason. Thank you all for coming today. So machine learning is a very common term nowadays. We're gonna have a quick look at it and see how we can use the fancy machine learning methods in the field of agriculture and environmental science. So what is machine learning? Machine learning is the science and art of programming the computers so they can learn from data. Instead of let the computer know the exact way to solve a specific problem, we show it some data as samples. We call it training sample or training data. And we hope that it learns how it works so it can itself solve that specific problem for the data which it has never seen. And why using machine learning? There are a couple of reasons why we tend to use machine learning instead of using some physical models or just letting the computer know the solution. And these are including the computers which require a lot of sort of rules to solve that problem, which might result in thousands of lines of code to let the computer know the way by which it should solve that specific problem. So instead of that, by just writing down a few hundred lines of code, we can do the same thing. The other thing is, for the problems we do not have any idea, and we have no idea about the mechanism, so we simply cannot provide any salvation rule. So instead, we can use machine learning. The other one is when we face the situations in which the condition might change in such a way that we need to add more rules, or we need to change the whole rules, it doesn't make sense to solve the problem but by providing the rules, but instead we can use machine learning. And yeah, so that's another way. And last but not least, in some cases, machine learning can provide useful information which cannot be easily captured without using machine learning. So one of the most important ways of using machine learning in our field is to make some models to estimate or classify the data we want. And it has four main steps. One is that we ourselves should have some idea and assumptions about our data. Then based on that assumptions, we will go and pick up some algorithms. And then we feed training data to those algorithms so that it can learn how to solve similar problems. And then we apply it to make some predictions, hoping that our model can generalize its way of solving data to new data. But there are some challenges there. So in some cases, we cannot use machine learning, or it might be quite difficult to use machine learning. One is that machine learning is kind of stupid. So we need to feed it with a large amount of training data, otherwise it cannot learn. So at least we need thousands of samples for training a machine learning model efficiently. In some cases, we need millions. So if your data is not that large, don't even think about machine learning. The other thing is non-representative training data, which happened, well, not for machine learning, but it happened in 2016 when most of the polls showed that Hillary Clinton is going to win the election, but since the training data was not good enough, it was biased. And the reason was that some of the Trump's fans were not willing to reveal that they're going to vote for him. So simply, if such a thing happened to our machine learning methods, our algorithms, then they're not able to provide any good result. The other one is poor data quality, which means that your data might be noisy, or for some reason it might be not reliable. So you cannot do anything with machine learning. It's not going to add any beneficial thing to your bad data. Irrelevant features. Let's say, as an economist, you're going to predict based on your input data to estimate the GDP per capita for countries. And let's assume that you feed your machine learning model by giving it the data from Norway, Kuwait, and Sweden. Your machine learning model might assume that the GDP per capita might have some relationship between GDP per capita and W in the name of your country. So that is one thing which you really need to be aware of, and that is why you need to have a good information about your data you're going to use. And overfitting and underfitting are other problems which might happen during using machine learning. So overfitting happens when your model is complicated, but your feeding data or training data are small or quite noisy. So that's a great chance that you face a model which is suffering from overfitting. And underfitting is just vice versa. So your model is too simple to capture underlying relationship between your input data and your output. And the other thing which we really need to consider is the Occam's razor, which simply says that don't go for complex models when there is no necessity. This is William of Ockham was a theologian and a philosopher, but it has some consequences for science as well, and that is, as long as your simple models do the job appropriately, there is no need to go for more fancy machine learning or deep learning models, because they're not going to add anything to you, but rather consuming more time and energy to train them. So just to make an overall view of what I've told you, machine learning is about making machines get better at some tasks. By learning from data, in a machine learning model, instead of giving the algorithm the exact solution way, we train it by some samples, and we expect it to give some predictions or estimations for the data it has never seen before. And the system might not perform well if we don't consider the important points I had mentioned before regarding choosing the algorithm, and more importantly, the data by which we're going to feed the algorithms. And your model neither should be too simple or too complicated. So by saying that, let's have a look at the meaning of deep learning and providing 3 cutting-edge algorithms by which you might be beneficial in your own researches. So deep learning, in a shallow learning algorithm provided by ANN, or artificial neural networks, we usually have a layer of input, a layer of output, and a layer in between, which is called hidden layer. So this figure. But when we have just one hidden layer, it is called shadow learning. But as soon as we add one layer, hidden layer, or more to our network, then we would have deep learning. So deep learning is has nothing extra, but just at least one or a couple of extra number of hidden layers. And how many layers do we need? Well, it depends on how complex your data is, but the majority of problems can easily be solved by using 2 or 3 hidden layers at most. And now let's have a look at 3 different deep learning models which can be beneficial for agriculture scientists. One of them, or the first one, is recurrent neural networks, which, unlike the feed-forward neural networks, the information through the layers not only can be transformed from the beginning to the end, but also it can get back. And by that, it is capable of providing better analysis and predictions for any sort of sequential data. For instance, in our field, time series can be a good sample of be analyzed by recurrent neural networks. So, I mean, the main idea behind that is that the order or the sequence of our input data can add extra value to our prediction. I personally use that in my research, and guess what? It didn't provide any better results. So I was not lucky, but you might be luckier than me. So 2 samples of using recurrent neural networks, here long short-term memory. The one is used in Brazil to map rice crops based on, I mean, it was a classification problem trying to recognize the growth, the phenological stage of rice based on remote sensing data. And a couple of different machine learning methods, including LSTM, random forest, key near neighbors, support vector machine, and naive bias are used. All of them are shallow, but LSTM and bidirectional LSTM provided the best results there. The other one was about predicting evapotranspiration while we do not have enough variables. So the main, for using Penman-Monteith equation to estimate evapotranspiration, we need 7 different input features. But here, by just using 3 inputs instead of 7, LSTM provided better results compared with Penman-Monteith and the adjusted Hargreaves-Samani equations. Second deep learning method, which I'm going to refer to, is called convolutional neural networks, which is applied to images. So if your work has anything to do with analyzing images, like analyzing satellite images, then it might be a suitable algorithm for you. And what it does is that it applies a couple of sort of filtering processes to your image. It removes the data which are not useful, but keeps the ones which are useful for your specific estimation or classification. And by doing that for a couple of times, it is capable of bringing some information which cannot be captured easily by using classical machine learning models. Here at the left side, you can see how it can read handwriting of different numbers. And the usage, Kaki et al. Used the method to classify corn hybrids to see whether they are tolerant against salinity and heat. And it turned out that it provided better results comparatively. The other one is related to estimating soil moisture from satellite data. And here, the authors combined CNN with, they used CNN to estimate soil moisture and compared it to the shallow learning methods. And it provides between 2.5 to 6.2% of better estimation.
5 minutes?
Oh, yeah. We're almost there. So the third one is called Generative Adversarial Networks, GANs. And how it works is that it includes two ANN networks, two neural networks competing with each other. The one is called generator, which tries to generate fake data. The other one is called discriminator, which is trained by real data and supposed to figure out whether the data coming from the generator is fake or genuine. So by doing that, they keep going up until the level that the generator is capable of providing the fake data, which are so good that the discriminator cannot recognize whether it is fake or real. And so you might have watched some deepfake videos that works with GANs. And here, these pictures, which looks like very genuine, are quite fake. Just none of these guys have ever existed on the earth, but it's just some sort of the magic which can be done using GANs. But what has it to do with agriculture? I think that in any case that you do not have enough data because of, I don't know, lack of time, the cost, ethical issues associated with that specific experiment, or any other reason, you might be able to use GANs to fabricate good data for you, by which you can do some processing and provide good results. Let's have a look at some of the examples of using GANs in the researches. The first one is it has been used to add some data to remote sensing images, and it was capable of increasing the accuracy of a classification problem up to 7% compared with the same algorithm using just real data. The second one is about MRI imaging, and it used a combination of GANs and CNN, and the results were quite amazing. It increased the resolution of the image, the MRI images, including more detail, which was useful for that specific research. The other one is also a combination of one-dimensional CNN and GANs, and it was working on salt tolerance of the seedling, and GANs helped the CNN to provide up to more than 90% of accuracy improvement, which is really amazing. And if you're interested in putting your hands on machine learning, then these 3 books would be quite beneficial for you. The first one includes the theory behind explaining different algorithms and the things which you need to consider to use them. The second one includes is less theory and more piece of Python codes by which you can use and see the results. But to do that, you need to have a decent background of Python. And if you do not have, the third book would be a good place to start it. And these are the references. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you. Got a few minutes for questions. Yeah.
You said that machine learning could be using the physical principles that you already know. So, for example, if in the evaporation example, you already know that when there's more solar radiation, usually there's more evaporation. So what sort of algorithms use that information?
Sorry, I didn't get your question.
How can you include physical principles that you know into machine learning?
You mean you use physical models to help machine learning provide better results?
Yes.
Off the top of my head, one of the ways might be to use ensemble models. So you give the results coming from the physical model, as well as you feed the algorithm by the input features, and then you add another layer of machine learning to make a weight out of two different outcomes, one from physical model and the other coming from machine learning, and then there is a chance that it improves the results. It might be other ways as well, but I have no idea if there's such a thing.
So the old-fashioned way of doing these things was to use statistics. And, I just wonder what the link is between these models and regression, or possibly Bayesian statistics, which might be applicable.
Actually, machine learning uses very much from statistics, but it is supposed to add something to that. So Bayesian statistics, for instance, can be used to hyper-tuning or tuning machine learning methods. As far as I know, it might have some other applications as well, but to me, at least, Bayesian statistics can help the tuning part of using machine learning. Also, there's a very important relationship between statistics and machine learning. But machine learning is, machine learning goes beyond statistics. Yeah.
You said you would look at your data and make some assumptions and then choose a model. Could it be more advantageous to, instead of choosing a model from assumptions you've made, to just test a range of models?
Well, it depends. Well, there are many different models. So maybe hundreds of them there. It is very difficult to use all of them and see which one works better. So the better way is that based on the assumptions you have from your data, you pick out a few algorithms which you think have better chance of providing better results. So that is the way you can consider that. Yeah.
What happens when you have no assumptions underlying it? If you have no idea how your data behaves, can you just train, like, if you have a supercomputer, just go and check every single model into it, or something like that?
The problem with that is it's going to be quite time consuming, but we have another point as well. There is an article published in 2001 suggesting that, or claiming that, if you have enough data, there is no problem. There isn't any significant difference between the performance of different machine learning models or algorithms. So if you have too much data, then it is not important that you're going to use ANN or random forest or extreme gradient boost. But if your data is not infinite, then it is, well, one way is to have a look at the literature review to see what the others have done and which algorithm seems to work better with your data.
We probably should start thinking about drawing things to a close, and I'm sure Atbin's been using machine learning tools throughout his PhD, and I'm sure he'd be happy to continue a conversation about how to apply that amongst your own work as well in collaboration and cooperation. So, yeah, thank you, Atbin and Caitlin, for the talks. It's great to see everyone here for This is the second seminar now, and there's a bunch of people online. So I hope this momentum keeps going. Our next one is going to be on the 21st of July, and that's Sharon Hickey and Grace Schlitt-Dean, and they're going to be sort of brought into sort of environmental science topic to be announced, but look out for that one on the 21st. And otherwise, thanks again. Have a good afternoon.